come to Myth 7, and we're looking today at Kachinas and Green Knights. We're beginning to appreciate that as the supernatural comes into play, the Mythic Horizon, which has been a flow that has annealed itself to nature, now begins to have a very curious quality to it. Perhaps the greatest image in modern literature of this phenomenon is in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, when Frodo and his companions, led by Aragorn, and Frodo has been wounded by the Morgul king's death phantom and is slowly not dying, but fading into the obliteration of the evil world. They are met by a knight, Prince Glorfindel, who is escorting them to the elf lord's place at Rivendell. And there the elf lord is the only figure within reach who can heal Frodo and bring him back into life. But in the meantime, what has happened is that the 9 evil riders have accumulated together, and their energy together is such that they can penetrate through all of the defenses of everyone there. Aragorn, Glorfindel, the entire range of what has been arrayed as protection. And Glorfindel gives his horse to the wounded, dying Frodo, and he says, ride as fast as you can and get across the river, because the river is the bound. It is the marginal magic bound to the land which is supernaturally protected by elves who are immortal. They do not die. And so is protected by eternal magic. And the river is the first marginal quality of that realm. And if Frodo can get across, then he will be saved. And indeed, he just barely makes it across. And the 9 evil phantom lords are driven and compelled one last time to try and get him. And as they go into the stream, the river, changes from a natural river to a supernatural river. And it becomes a torrent. And in the torrent, Tolkien describes very beautifully how the sudden seething waves resemble phantom fairy horse warriors bearing down and sweep away the 9 lords, who, because evil also has a timeless quality, they will eventually be restated and be formidable again. But for the time, they have been washed away by supernatural protection. So that the Mythic Horizon is a natural stream. It is a natural dynamic because it has gained this natural quality by flowing with nature. And yet, nature is not the existential quality of form that we are habituated to thinking that it is. Nature itself is pure process, but it is purely mysterious process for reasons that we will discover at the last phase of our education. We will then learn why it is that nature is mysterious, is a mysterious, pure process. Existence as a ritual stability of form, as existentials, emerges out of the mysteriousness of nature and in turn the vibratory resonance of these stable forms of existentials generate the energy dynamic that becomes the mythic horizon. So that when you have a form is not just there, it reverberates. And part of the reverberation, we know now that nothing is static whatsoever. Everything is in an iterative vibration, many billions of times per given time unit. And that in this, one then has a source of electromagnetic energy that is able to come into a cinched form of matter, energy becoming matter, and that matter has always with it a cue of a frequency, so that the formula, by now almost written everywhere in the world, E equals mc squared, Einstein's famous equation of relativity. The energy equals the mass times the speed of light squared. Squared because there is a geometricity to the area of the energy when it is brought into a cinched form. Otherwise, space would be infinite and not even be space. It would be what we would call the real. But as soon as matter is cinched into existential form, space itself becomes formalized and can be dealt with like the square of light then makes a range of field of space which has a form also. And also conveys formality to time. And as we saw when we began our education, time is the first dimension, not the fourth. And space, when it blossoms out of time, almost immediately, constitutes a four-dimensional continuum, but it is only a four-dimensional continuum in respect to the fact that it is formalized and put into formal resonance around existentials. You can think of it this way, that the existentials pepper the real, and as they pepper the real, their flavor becomes palpable so that one now has a soup, one has a stew. And time-space itself is a flavored stew, flavored because existentials are now formal. And they're objective. And they're objective, by the way, to any degree of specificity. One can, with great confidence, go into any level of specificity in terms of existential objectivity. At Caltech, over the last 10 or 15 years, a whole level of time has been investigated called the femtosecond time. An Arabic genius named Zewail, Professor Zewail, and his people at Caltech have whole textbooks now in femtochemistry. Because on the femto level, one can see molecular chemical reactions. You can see how molecular chemistry actually moves and reacts specifically, and how each iteration has its exact quality, and only by the collection of those iterations into time-paced sets do the iterations then acquire larger and larger orders of stability, so that their stability then fans out and begins to include more and more until all time-space and these existentials are exactly formal and objective together. In just the last 2 years, the next level in refinement, called the attosecond, And on the attosecond level, we're able for the first time to see atomic reactions. And on that level, we know now that the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus don't just sit there. They also orbit each other around a center which is not anything other than the barycenter of that nucleus. And so the entire objective universe is resonantly objective to any degree of specificity, but what comes out of that for us, for living beings, is the reverberation in a new dynamic which has always been called experience. And not just our experience. Animals have experience. Plants have experience. Minerals, in their organic configuration, generate their kind of experience as well. And so all life, all organic life, blossoms out of, into this experience, much like space blossoms out of time in the first place. And so experience becomes available on more and more expanded levels. Our level of experience is enormously expanded beyond that of just bacteria, enormously beyond that of plants and even of animals, although some animals approach us very closely, like the chimpanzee. But more and more, the cadence of the rhythm of experience anneals itself in the dynamic to the way in which time blossoms space in the first place, and what blossoms then out of rhythmic time in mythic experience is feeling-toned images, which are the pepper seeds out of which language then occurs. And so language is very much a parallel to nature, and has, because it participates in a parallel with nature, it has its own mysteriousness. And language is enormously mysterious. And like last week, we read a quotation from the Einstein of linguistics, Roman Jacobson, of how Franz Boas was the first cultural anthropologist to understand that there are two different components to mythic language. One of them is most certainly the component of the images and their feelings generating a further objectivity in symbolic thought, an interior space in the mind, which now becomes the theater of a new kind of objectivity, of symbol objectivity. And that it has the ability to do a reflection from the objective mind back to experience, and experience gains a symbolic element. It gains meaning. The images now become meaningful. But also, language has a compulsive, or better yet, a compulsory trigger element to it, because it comes out of ritual as well. And so language in the mythic horizon has initially this ritual base, which it must be said exactly right, or it has no efficacy. One must pronounce the words exactly right, or it's not going to denote what it needs to denote. But when symbols come into play in a mirrored retrojective quality, the mythic horizon now becomes a charmed flow, a charmed stream. It has all kinds of phantom spirit qualities that were not there in nature, in the sense that they were observable in the sense that they were existential, in the sense now they are in experience just now emerged. And so experience has a very perilous and precarious quality. One aspect of it, it's like a ratio. The common denominator is that it comes out of existential objectivity. The other part of that ratio is that it comes out of symbolic, meaningful proliferation on a higher integral. Not yet differential, still integral, but much more complex. And so from the just so quality of ritual and the complexity of symbols, those two objectivities now give a different texture to the process of experience. And this is the phase, for the first time, that a weave occurs. That it isn't just that the mythic process parallels nature, but they now sometimes go against each other. And in the friction of going against each other, those qualities generate the sparks of images. And so the Mythic Horizon now has not only images that are ritual in their traction, but some are symbol in their traction, and you get a very complex situation. And out of this comes the problem of the Kachinas and the Green Knights. In order for our tribe, in order for our people to live, for our culture to succeed, we are faced now with a challenge which is new. It is not the challenge that comes from needing to be absorbed in nature and participate with it. It's not even the challenge of having the rituals done right. It's the challenge of the rituals done right in face of a supernatural that could easily interfere with them, in the sense of shorting it out. And one of the qualities that mythic experience in its complexity now faces is the problem of death, which is a natural part of life, and obliteration, annihilation, which is a supernatural evil that is not a part of life, is not a part of nature. And so all beings like ourselves who are able to come into the complexity of that kind of experience, we must face an integral distinction between death and obliteration. An obliteration would be an evil. And a death can occur and be untimely, unseemly, even fearful, but the evil is not a fearfulness. It's a terror. It is a panic. And so the mythic god of war has two sidekicks, terror and panic. Phobos and Deimos, the two little moons that go around Mars. And so there is a kind of not a negative so much, but a nothing penumbra around evil. And that while coming into danger brings panic, confronting it in a challenge way brings in terror as well. And so that one becomes subject now not just to a challenge which is fearful, but one becomes exposed to the terror of evil. When we get to looking at history next year, and we come to someone as enormously mature as Mircea Eliade, and we take a look at one of his books called The Myth of the Eternal Return. The last section of that book is called The Terror of History. And the 20th century was so garroted by the terror of total annihilation, not of death, but of annihilation, that we were almost put into limbo. We have survived, but the civilization did not. It died. And so part of our challenge now is to generate a new civilization, one which has the wisdom of ancient forebears to ourselves, that deals initially with terror before it gets its generation, so that we will become inoculated. And that civilization will not be subject to that kind of shorting out. And that instead of the empty being a terrific specter of annihilation, it becomes a further amplitude for time-space to explore as a whole different outlook. One of the most brilliant, poignant sayings 400 years ago was by Blaise Pascal in his Pensées. He said, "Those infinite spaces and voids between the stars terrorize me." He was the first to make a computer. He was the first to make mechanical links that link and make orders. And so Pascal is an enormously important individual. We have been struggling for 400 years with trying to come to terms to this, but humanity as a whole has been struggling many thousands of years for this. One of the qualities in this is the mythic image of losing your head. And that evil is able to lose its head and then carry its head around to terrorize you with. And because it is headless, carrying its head, you are subject now to losing your head, in the sense that your whole symbolic, meaningful complexity is going to be absolutely frozen, like the king cobra that comes and paralyzes the victim and then bites. Because if you have the complexity of a symbolic meaning and your mind is frightened out of its wits, you are then left with an undefendable existentiality. And not that you will die, but you are now subject for annihilation. And of course, one of the great qualities that's involved in this is that very frequently the figure who is in that nether world that can be brought back to life, can be resurrected, is a green. But a pale green also in a living organism is a sign that the infection is lethal. If the phlegm is yellow, you're infected. If it's pale green, you're close to a death. Gangrene turns green. Pale green is the livid color of corpses all over the world. In Tibetan Buddhism, as Heinrich Zimmer points out in his wonderful book, The King and the Corpse. Green. Green is that color. He says here, in folklore and fairy tale, the dead not uncommonly carry their heads under their arms to frighten the people they meet. They toss their heads up in the air and play ninepins with their skulls. So that the skull also is a head. Pale green further is the color of livid corpses. The paintings of Tibetan art, which adhere to their color symbolism in a very definitely prescribed tradition, employ a green to denote whatever appertains to the kingdom of King Death. And of course, as soon as we say that, we realize that in ancient Egyptian iconography, Osiris is green. is the only mythic god. And the whole Egyptian scheme was green. And he is not only been killed so that he has died, but he's been dismembered. He's been dismembered into 14 parts that have been scattered throughout all the different nomes in Egypt. And in order for his bride, Osiris is not only the god of resurrection, but the god of death. He's King Death. It's like this. He can be resurrected by his bride, by Death's bride, by Isis, because it is life who is Death's bride. And when Death marries life, they together have a mysterious fertility that allows for a whole new iteration to come into being. An iteration that includes both life and death as a complementarity so that they are not polarized. One doesn't negate the other, but they weave together in a larger cycle of a dynamic which is now a higher integral. So that when death and life are woven together, they are not an integral in nature. They are an integral in experience when it has a supernatural complexity patterning the weave. You can think of it this way. If the mythic is purely natural, you would have a weaving that would be natural fiber. It would be the color of the natural fiber and just be a plain ground. But as soon as there's an imagery in that weave, that imagery has a feeling tone complexity because some kind of symbolic reflection has been going on. And the initial symbolic reflection, because it is so heavily weighted towards the ritual, the first images that come are geometric, geometricity. And it's only later that the geometric begins to get the configurations of existentials rather than of just natural patterns. And so you begin to get not just the geometricity, but you begin to get the face in the weaving. There's a famous story by Henry James called The Beast in the Jungle. This man wonders as he sits in his chair, his well-appointed place. He has this Persian rug that has all the animals and plants all woven together constantly into this beautiful pattern, and he wants very much to have a life that will be complete. And he knows he has been missing one thing. He's been missing the Isis in his life, the right woman in his life. To bring that all into its lively, fertile fruition so that it is life eternal. And she has never shown up. And then, near the end of Henry James' story, he's staring at the rug and musing how he has missed out on eternal life. And he's being served his tea by the faithful old female servant who's been with him for 50 years. And suddenly, in a flash of humility that brings tears, he realizes she has been the one all this time. She's always been with him, and that he has achieved it. This is a quality where the mythic horizon now becomes a vibrant field of challenge, the response to which must be both what we really do exactly and the higher integral of meaningfulness allowed to make its proliferation into complexity and not to fear that. So that the symbolically complex and the ritual exactness together now make a new kind of a complementarity. And out of that complementarity, one finds a new kind of vibratory iteration called consciousness. And that consciousness is a vibratory iteration of the completed integral, but that it happens in such a way that it can happen very small and not be noticed. It can be very slight and not be tended to. Or it can come in such rare, quick glimpses that one doesn't have any way to image it. One only sees the glare and doesn't have the contemplative power to resolve in that glare the image which is really there, exactly there. I'll give you an example. Some of you have been here for a long time may have heard this some years ago. One time in San Francisco, I was about 27 years old, and I was sitting with Shenryu Suzuki Roshi at the Zen temple, Zendo, on Bush Street in San Francisco. And I happened to be alone in the dark amplitude of the Zendo one time. I'm just there, very deep into a samadhi. And Suzuki Roshi came in from a side, and there was like a shaft of light, like a sun dagger, through the whole amplitude. And it was so quick and fast that all I saw was the dust motes in the air. And as he came through with the black Zen Buddhist robes, he was visually invisible going by, but all the dust motes swirled after him like a magnetic thing. And so later, in talking with him, he asked a very simple question. Not a question, but a koan. He said, in some kind of emphasis, why do you smoke? And of course I said, pardon me, did you say, why do I smoke? Or did you say, why do I smoke? Why do I smoke? Why do I smoke? There was an emphasis someplace there on one of those words, and it made all the difference to the syntactic meaning, but his grammar was so subtle that I was compelled to realize that it was exact. He did say something exact. What exactly it was, I had to find out. That's the compulsory element. It's what prayer sticks with the Zuni are all about. If those are put out there like koans to the divine, they must respond. They will respond. You can count on it. Life counts on existence being responsive, exactly. And we can count on it. For me, after about 2 months of cutting back on cigarettes, getting down to one a day just to see, well, what is that one? I remember an old, one of the originators of Playhouse 90, Joe Hines, was trying to quit smoking when I was about 19, and he would cut his Lucky Strikes in half. He said, this way I get 40 light-ups per pack. And he said, it cuts my chances of cancer in half. And so I would get down, and finally I realized that there was something here that the meaning was completely tied up with my understanding this, and that there was something obviously not refined yet. I've been meditating since I was 6 months old. So I thought, we're going to have this out. So I went to the high Sierras, went above Lake Tahoe. This is in the summer, Heavenly Valley at that time. This is back in 1968. It was still kind of wild. They hadn't built all the houses on the Kingsbury Grade. And so I went up about 10,000 feet. And I was looking for the right place to sit and have it out. This mind is going to be put completely on the line. That little rucksack had a wide-brimmed trail hat, and saw this grove of greenery, and there was a boulder, a polished West Sierra Nevada boulder exactly there, and I thought, that's it, right there. The image was like immediate, and as I went torrentially. And threw the rucksack off because this is spirit gunfighter time, right here, now. And as it threw off my shoulder and I brushed off the hat and sat in immediate deep samadhi on the rock, out of the rucksack, a little juice can flipped and glinted and then rolled down. I was there in the deep samadhi. As I powered up and went into it, all of a sudden, in my inner mind's image, there floated this gray-green ellipse that finally came up and had, in blue script, sun-kissed. I leapt off that rock, went down there, grabbed that juice can, and there it was. It was a sun-kissed grapefruit juice, a can of it. I realized I still had the powers to resolve even the trademark script right out of the glare of the sunlight out of the corner of my eyes. So there was nothing wrong with my contemplative exactness. And that was the whole koan. That every single word in that had been pronounced as a trill. Not word by word, but the whole phrase received its quality. And in Buddhism, a moment of thought is called a bodhicitta. And a bodhicitta, a moment of thought, has 16 parts to it. It has 8 parts that are discursively able to be made distinct, like the 8 notes of a scale. But the other 16 are never discursive. They always occur together as a trill. And so if one is counting them in a spiritual way, you count them as 9. The 9th. 8th reveals the 9th. And the 9th is as complex as the 8, but its complexity is such that it only occurs together as a trill. That's why our learning has 8 phases, but has 8 intervals as well. And the 8 intervals are equal to the 8 phases, but they occur as a trill. Their distinctness is indistinct in the realm of process and form, but real in reality. And so reality is, the Upanishads were called by Aldous Huxley and Swami Prabhupada and Krishna Parishar the breath of the eternal. And when one speaks that way, what is in between all of the words is the breath of the eternal. Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra says that when you do it this way, when you speak this way, it's pranama. One makes it real by saying it so in that way. And now you have a mythic language that has a grammatical, ritual quality and a symbolic complexity given a new kind of a breath. It's given itself now as a magic language, and anything pronounced in a magic language is able to engender new possibilities that were never there in the integral. And instead of them being demonic or angelic, as they would be in the integral, they now become spiritually personable in terms of the cosmos. This way, one says something that is not only realistic, but really realistic. A deeper practicality than existence itself. And so the Mythic Horizon, when it gets to this level, it has to make sure that the oblique gestalt is that human beings understand it's not just to survive, but it's to allow for the survival or the not survival to both be cycled in the real. And this is very high wisdom. Instead of just knowing, it's high wisdom. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back. We're looking at the phase of myth, and that this phase of myth is something that occurs out of our inquiry out of our learning. And that the phase, as a phase, emerges from the establishment ritually of the set. And as we sequence 12 presentations in 3 groups of 4, that 12 then will make a very traditional standard set. And so that it does not just remain a set, but acquires another dimension to it, we put an interval with it, and adding the interval to the set of 12 gives us both the properties of a set and of a phase, and we can do a lot with both those potentials. We now have with ourselves an inquiry that is literally, we have digitalized learning for the first time, not in terms of some kind of polarity, but in terms of a deeper relationality, a deeper pairing than polarity. Deeper than polarity is complementarity. And complementarity is the pair of 0 and 1. And only with a 0 and 1 pairedness do you achieve a binary that allows for specificity in form and for infinity in reality to work together with articulations of orders of process equally established without being reduced. It is the reduction of process which jails experience into the ritual comportment, into laws, into codes, into stricture, so that experience is not free. And also reduces consciousness to an awareness of the mind, which can be very powerful, but is minuscule compared to what consciousness is in its own process. Consciousness is the first differential process and is at home in infinite possibility, not just in brilliant ideas, well thought out and beautifully doctrinated. And so we have to guard against the inculcations of the doctrinaire mind and of the jailed experience. Both create prisoners. One is a prisoner mentality, the other is in fact an incarceration. And so freeing the body and freeing the mind are two of the classic objectives and purposes of an education. But there is always the third concomitant to that, and that is to free the person. And the person is a spirit, differential form, not an integral form. We're not limited to the body. We're not limited to this mind. Our persons indeed have a beautiful relationality, possibility, array with our bodies and our minds, and with other persons. But by achieving that expansion of form into differential form, we now have affinity. We bear a family resemblance to the cosmos as the infinite differential form. And so we are at home anywhere that we explore. This is a very deep issue, and almost no education has achieved this because there are many refinements that are necessary. One has to know how memory and imagination work. One has to know how feeling comes to be, how thought comes to be. And later on, when we get to symbols, we take a look at Suzanne K. Langer, whose Philosophy in a New Key, written at the end of World War II, honored her great teachers, Alfred North Whitehead and Ernst Cassirer, masters of symbols. And she says, in one of her essays on art, she said, "I'm scouting the possibility that thought is an elaboration of feeling. And so we have to learn that our intelligence is a refinement of sentience. The heart must be sentient, integrally. Otherwise, intelligence in symbolic thought will have its kind of indoctrinable, instructionable, towing lines, but it will never be really clear. And it is the clear mind that is open and available for transform, so that it does not distort when a conscious vision comes into play, not as a force, but as a dimension. And it's the quintessential fifth dimension that allows for the transform of four-dimensional time-space. And when you can transform through a five-dimensional process, what comes out of it is a six-dimensional form, which is the person. It's a completely different scale. There's a famous early mathematical science fiction novel called Flatland, of people who live in two dimensions. And they have a great deal of trouble imagining what a three-dimensional being would be like, because they only live in a flat land, a two-dimensional plane. And of course, as soon as you get to a three-dimensional cubic volume, one gets now not just geometry, but one gets trigonometric relationalities, which are much more fun. Now one can do all kinds of things you couldn't do before. And just so, if you get to a five-dimensional conscious space-time, the potential, the possibilities are whole orders beyond what they were before. Even if you mastered the entire integral, it becomes just one vector in a matrix that is expandable. And now one doesn't just draw lines, one has things like vector analysis. You can do a lot with it. It's the difference between counting on your fingers and being able to compute how many grains of electron sparks there might be in all the galaxies in the cosmos. One can do this. And so this is a learning. It's an education that is new because it has never been tendered before, because we are just now freshly complex integrally and differentially, so that it is something needed, something necessary. Necessary and sufficient. Two of the criteria that Leibniz pointed out when you're doing a real calculus. It must be not just a good idea, but it must be necessary and sufficient. We're looking at the Kachinas of the Zuni and of the Green Knight in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and they are supernaturals. And we're looking at how being confronted with terror is different from being fearful. And that there is a depth in this that is easy to miss if one is not natural. And if one is natural, then one's feeling-toned mythic horizon becomes alerted to it. And that quality is loneliness. And one of the motives for the Zuni Kachinas is that the Kachinas are supernatural beings sent by the spirits of their lost children, so that there would not be this annihilating loneliness in human life. So that the parents of these children are comforted out of their loneliness by the not only the rhythmic, serious dancing, but the gaiety of the feathers, the colors, the masks, and the whole emphasis that the Zuni impressed upon all of the anthropologists who would get it, who would listen and listen with their whole being, and some of the women that were taking, Ruth Bunzel, Ruth Benedict, Gladys Reichard, they all were able to hear the Zuni people and to write about it. And one of the qualities that comes is that the Kachinas have their own village, which is at the bottom of a lake near St. John's, Arizona. And that in their wanderings, originally the Zuni people, in their original quest for a holy land. A holy land is a place not only where you can live, but where you can be real. That's why it's a holy land. It not only allows you to live, it allows you to live real. And there, by that lake, on that shore, was where they first were able to live and be real. And though they migrated further from that to Corn Mountain, and then from that over to Zuni, over a long duration of time, obviously many thousands of years. The Zuni, the Pueblos as a people, go back to the first migrations to our hemisphere. There were two. One was about 25,000 years ago. The second was about 12,000 years ago. The Pueblo peoples belong to the first. They have a different blood type from North American Indians. And this quality of being able to go back and be there by that lake, and under that lake at the bottom is where the Kachina village is. But it's not at the bottom of the lake so much is that it is at the quintessential center of that lake, which turns out to be, in our understanding, the bottom of the lake, but is the essential center of the volume of that water, of that lake. And so the Kachinas belong to the way in which it was phrased 1,500 years ago by one of the greatest mystics in the world, Dionysius the Areopagite. He called it the super-essential. It's the super-essential. It would be essential if it were symbolic, but because it is transcendentally conscious, it is super-essential. Or, as it was talked about in later alchemy, it's quintessential. You not only have the set of the four fingers, but now you have the fifth, movable, the thumb, which makes it possible not just to grasp, but to sculpt, to gesture. And it's one of the oldest ways in the world, because when written language first came in, it was little palm-shaped bits of clay stamped with a stylus in cuneiform. And so one literally held written understanding in the palm of one's hand, and that's where the old philosophic gesture came in, that if you got it, you did that. You got it. Whereas the deeper high wisdom was that one did that. One got it and one taught it out. So that you didn't get it to keep it, you got it to process it for others. So that understanding and teaching together are a complementarity of the high wisdom. Now, it's not just to understand something, but it is to be able to deliver it. And you really understand when you are able to teach it to someone else. Then you are the conduit of the real, rather than the possessor of just the treasure, or of the giver of a supposed treasure that others have. Then you are the real conduit together. And so the magician become the artist. A magician may understand and may be able to at least try to deliver something, but only the artist And so art is born out of magic. Art is born out of visionary consciousness because it is that new kind of gem. It's not just the pretty agate-like crystal, like the kind of cloudy, reddish crystal that one would get in northern Thailand that when it's cut right, it becomes a ruby. And one has then a different quality. One has the prismatic light of the kaleidoscopic spirit. And this indeed reflects the scintillation of all the stars, and then we are at home in the cosmos. Then our persons are real. The Zuni, standing there on the shore of that lake, the Kachina village, and that quintessential below, they invite the Kachinas to come out of that village and come to their villages, come to Zuni. And they're invited by prayer sticks. By prayer sticks which have feathers on them, because these feathers on them will become the quintessential, superessential seeds of the clothing of the Kachinas. And the food offerings, the sacrifices, they don't eat the food, but they imbibe the superessential, nutritive qualities of the food. And so they are invited to come. But there's also a quality here of give and take. The prayer sticks, which are made in a ritual ceremony over several days, all the men must make prayer sticks so that it's offered by the community as a whole. Because it is the threshold of fullness that is the triggering element. And it works just like saturation. If you dissolve so much salt in warm water, it will dissolve and dissolve, and when it gets so that the liquid is saturated, is no longer a liquid but is a plasma. And when it reaches the plasma state, one more grain of salt will precipitate the salt out. It will recrystallize. And so all good rituals saturate themselves into nature so that nature now becomes like a charged plasma, and adding just one more thing, even if it were a mythic experience essential, will recrystallize everything out, and you will have life again. The year will be able to go on. It will rain. You'll be able to plant. And so the Kachinas make rain, but they make rain out of the compassion of healing that susceptibility to loneliness that would be misunderstood by man. And in that misunderstanding of the real poignancy of loneliness, which includes the ability to have solitude, which includes the ability to love, to really miss the other, and not just to know it, but to really miss them. And especially put not in that one just misses one's lost love. One misses the dead child, even more poignantly than one's own death. And it is this assuaging that in many layers that the Kachinas perform, because they are the spirits of the lost children that come back as divine ones to allow loneliness to be an experience, but not to be mistaken for being isolated to the point of being susceptible to annihilation. No one loves me. There is no love. There is no solitude. And so part of the mythology of the Kachinas is that all of the boys in the village are whipped before the Kachinas come. The boys between 5 years old and about 9 years old. Because one of the early myths of it is that when the masked dancing was first introduced to the Zuni culture thousands of years ago, one of the boys in the myth recognized his relative had been in that mask, there must not be any Kachinas. It must just be people wearing masks. So there are no gods. And so when the Kachinas heard this, they came searching for him. And his parents hid him because they didn't want the Kachinas to wreak vengeance. And they put the boy into a fourth level, into the deepest level of a complex kiva so that he would be really hidden. He's down there in the sub basement. And when the Kachinas came searching for him, calling his name, couldn't be found anywhere. And so the Shalako priest, who's the head of the interface of the Kachina energy and the people, made a huge implosion in the sound world, and there was a slight earthquake and the house cracked. And then did it 4 times, and by the 4th time, the cracks crumbled the building into the foundations, and there was revealed the boy, and they cut off his head. And they threw his head up in the air, and they played kickball with his head, and took the headless body back. And so here you have the head gone, and the headless body is a part of an atonement, a retoning back to a calibration, not of, well, that boy should have been allowed to live with his head on his body, but back to the deeper calibration of the real. His head had to come off from that body so that one could face that terror and survive and come through, and life again has all of its dimensions. Now, this is a famous kind of equality. One of the wonderful short novels about it is by Thomas Mann called The Transposed Heads. About Sita of the beautiful hips, and about the way in which Shiva and his Parvati and many other things. And in the dedication here, it says, to Heinrich Zimmer, the great Indian scholar returned with thanks. Written in 1941, written during 1940, at a time when the Nazis were taking over France and all of Europe was just being incarcerated in something that seemed not just bad news, but really evil. Really evil. Heinrich Zimmer, in his The King and the Corpse, which was published first in 1948, Zimmer had written it much earlier in the 1930s, but when he went, he had to flee the Nazis like a great many people, and he went to New York City, and he was lecturing at Columbia. And he caught a cold, and he died in 1943. And the person who edited his papers, his literary executor, was Joseph Campbell. And so Joseph Campbell learned to be Joseph Campbell by editing over years and years and years Heinrich Zimmer's papers. And almost all of his books were published by the Bollingen series. And the Bollingen series was made available by the Mellons, especially Mary Mellon, the wife. And she committed a great deal of the Mellon fortune to making a series of books that would include all the works of Jung, maybe 100 volumes in different series and sets, so that everything that was jeopardized by World War II and by the Nazis would have a chance to be in public circulation. So this is like a great book series. Just like the great book series of Robert Hutchins and the Encyclopedia Britannica when it was bought by the University of Chicago. Instead of just having an encyclopedia a la the Française or the English of previous centuries, now we're going to have an arrangement also of great books. And these qualities of having sets or arrangements of great books, the Harvard 5-foot shelf, the Bollingen series, the great book series. Our education preserves those things because we take whole pairs of books all the time and we look at maybe 70 works, but it's an expansion. way beyond what these other series have been. But we also take a deep transform of another aspect that was brought out in education by one of the greatest inventors of the 20th century, Simon Ramo, who was originally with the Hughes Aircraft Company, then went to General Electric, and then became the brains behind the ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles for the American military. And when he realized that this was putting the entire life of the planet in jeopardy, he realized there has to be a different kind of an education. And so he wrote a pair of books, one, Cure for Chaos, and the other is A Century of Mismatch. And it's all about the systems approach to education. This was done in the late 1960s. And if you were around in education, it was like a landslide. Everyone was talking about the systems approach. And still today. That if one engineers this right, you can build components that work specifically, and you portion out so that whole populations of people now coordinately work together, and out of this comes something like the internet, eventually. But both that and like the great books were needed to be transformed into a higher orders, several orders higher, about 4 orders higher. And that's what we've done here. But because it is of a higher dimensionality, it's almost unhearable unless you just do it. Because you cannot hear it first, because the mind that you initially hear it with is too flat. It's like somebody who's tone deaf and doesn't hear that guitar of Segovia played that chakan exactly right. And that you could hear it maybe 20 times in a row and never get tired of it. Or that Renaissance Gavin was so skippingly light that one could dance all night. With a whole hall of nobles forgetting that they're noble and remembering that they're humanly real and loving to dance together. All of these qualities are there because in that lake experience of the ancient original Zuni, out of which the Kachinas come, the Kachinas are invited and also have a grammatical compulsory effect because the prayer sticks in their invitation are so exactly right that the Kachinas will do this. If you mix enough phosphorus with the sulfur, the match when struck will light. So it's not compulsory in the sense that, oh, well, you control them. It's that the invitation is one that cannot be refused. It's the other side of the offer that cannot be refused. This is the invitation that cannot be refused. It's a prayer for life, and life is bestowed when that prayer is real and not just a good idea. And not just that, well, it's opportune, it's time, we better make a prayer. No. This prayer is said in such a way that it is not only real in the mythic horizon of the experience in life, but it has a conscious, visionary dimension which is real in the beyond and comes into play like an added breath. And one can breathe in and out and not realize that in this cycle, it's like a cylinder that has a whole cycle, and there are 2 other phases in that cycle. Because in between breathing in and breathing out, there is a picosecond where there is a balance. You're no longer breathing in, and you have not yet begun to breathe out. In that picosecond, there is an equilibria in the breath cycle, and it also has its complement later, because after having breathed out, and just before you breathe back in, there's another equilibria, and those 2 pauses are the axis of a dimension called presence. And so in really high Dharma yoga, one not only practices breathing, but practices the axis of equilibria present at the same time. And one can get very good at this so that one's movements then are not just movements of this objectivity of the body, or even the objectivity of the body choreographed by the objectivity of the mind, but that the motion is seamless because it incorporates the articulation of presenced equilibria everywhere all the time. And out of that comes a different kind of emotion, and one then calls that a choreographed dance like a ballet. And in that ballet, one has a new scale of form. The classic 20th century version of it was that to have a trajectory from the Earth to the Moon is impossible unless you compute all of the movements. The Earth is spinning, the Earth is orbiting around the Sun, the Moon is orbiting around the Earth, the Sun itself is in motion in a cluster of stars, the whole arm of the galaxy is in motion, the entire galaxy is in motion, and if you don't have all of this, you can't get to the Moon. It's called celestial mechanics. You have to compute the axis of presence in the articulation of seemingly empty space, and then you can get to the Moon. And the first time that we were able to do that with Ranger 4 was incredible, was unbelievable. And the first soft landing was Surveyor 1. I think I read you my mystical poem written on the evening of the landing of Surveyor 1 in 1966. Surveyor 1 in the Ocean of Storms was the first time that the ballet called trajectory was so feather light that it was able to land and stand gently in the ocean of storms on our Moon. And it was a sign that we had understood. The quality for this in ancient times was duck hunting. We've talked about this, that the flight pattern, the wing motion of ducks, makes it impossible for you to hit them if you shoot at them. You have to learn to lead them in a special way. And so the Kachinas, when they come out of Kachina village from under that lake, they fly as ducks to Zuni, and when they get there, they land right outside the village, and as they do, it begins to rain, and they assume the masks with the feathers and clothing and come in dancing. All the saints come marching in, bearing life that can have loneliness as one of the qualities of feeling and not be devastated by it. To have solitude moments and not be flattened out by them. And it is this richness and variety then that allows experience to be rich enough so that it can transform into thought, into the mind. And the mind as an integral emerges out of the fullness of the imaged, languaged, feeling-toned experience of myth. And so symbols emerge out of that and become quite real. There is a deep quality to this. Zimmer points out at the end of The King and the Corpse in the section called On the Sipra Shore. Sipra is a lake. Its ancient name was Manasawar. And Manasawar is way up in the Himalayas. And it is nestled under one of the most dominant, massive mountain peaks on the planet, Mount Kailas, which is not just like a mountain, but is like a massive fullback of a mountain. Huge, huge. And to make the pilgrimage around Kailas is one of the ways in which the Vajrayana made high Dharma ritual. And you start at a certain point, and you make your ambulation, circumambulation around Kailas and come back, and that point is right there at the shore of Lake Manasawar. And out of that single lake run all the major rivers of India. The beginnings of the Indus, the beginnings of the Brahmaputra, the beginnings of the Ganges, all of the rivers that make India fertile come out of this lake. And it is there when Shiva is forlorn because Parvati has been taken from him by death. His guide, his guru, Brahma, takes Shiva to Manasawar and shows him the lake in its clarity, in its ability to have the storks and all the other life come and be quiet together into not something that is just aware, or even something which now has the beginnings of a kinesthetic relationality, but consciousness which becomes so pure that it tunes to the infinite real. And in that infinite real, Shiva is able to hear for the first time a new Parvati calling him, inviting him to come back into life. And so he leaves the pure, still, conscious lake of the Himalayas and goes back down into India to live again, to bring life again. Because the energy in its frequency, if calibrated to the real, is eternal. There's no death. And there also is no oblivion. Death becomes a part of life, and oblivion vanishes without a trace. One can go to extraordinary clarity, and what is left is not even a wisp of soot. The Buddha was once asked by that curious bodhisattva, arhat figure, Sariputra, who's an intellectual giant. He said, in your deep, cosmic, sentient intelligence, has anyone ever become enlightened by any other way than the way in which we are doing? And the Buddha said, not one. Not only in this universe, but in all. The phrase translates out of Magadhi Sanskrit as the trichillicosm, which means jillions upon jillions. Not even one. This quality of something that is so deep, not just that the green knight can hold his head, but always we find these figures. The Halloween pumpkin is a head that is taken off a figure. It's just the head. There are many different ways to understand this. It is the ability to integrate death and the afterworld and the netherworld with this world and the above world, so that the whole ecology is there and that life is rich everywhere that it will be, because it has the equilibrium of the breath of the real as an axis for its pivot of return. Life is eternal because it will always come back. It will always be again. Love will be real again. The children will be born again. No matter what has happened, no matter what will ever happen. And so setting aside the false worries of the fidgeting mind that says things have got to be this way, otherwise we're done for, or the uninformed body that says, well, I'm not sure. One comes into a different scale. One comes into the scale of confidence, not of the weekend excursion, but of the eternal adventure. More next week.